He moved into an abandoned farm, but shockingly, 3 gorgeous women were already living there. In the blazing heat of Texas territory, July 1889, a lone rider named Ethan Cole pushed his weary horse across the endless Rio Verde Valley, carrying nothing but a battered saddlebag and the heavy weight of his past. He was searching for silence, for a place where his mistakes could no longer follow him. Yet what he found was something far different. As the sun bled into the horizon, he spotted an abandoned farm standing crooked against the sky, its fences shattered, its barn leaning like it was ready to collapse. Dust swirled in the hot wind, every shadow whispering of lives long gone. Ethan dismounted, boots sinking into the dry earth, and for a moment he believed this broken land might finally give him peace. But just as his hand touched the creaking door, he froze, his heart pounding. From inside the silent ruins came the sound of faint laughter. The laughter echoed faint and haunting, pulling Ethan deeper into the hollow silence of the broken house. And when he pushed the warped door open, the dim light spilled across a sight he could never have expected. For instead of dust and emptiness, 3 women stood before him, their eyes sharp, their stance unshaken, their beauty striking against the ruin that surrounded them. And for a long breath he could not move, only taking in the strength they carried in the way they looked at him as if he had trespassed on sacred ground. But before he could speak, the tallest of them, with dark hair falling over her shoulders, raised her hand and told him firmly that he should not have come, that this farm was no place for strangers, her voice carrying a warning that felt heavier than the heat outside. And though his instinct urged him to leave, his curiosity held him rooted, wondering why anyone would choose to live in such desolation. Yet there they were, 3 figures bound by something unspoken, their faces etched with stories they did not share. And when he tried to explain he had no intention of harm, the second woman with eyes like cold water cut him off, insisting that the land was dangerous and that he must go before it was too late, her words sending a chill into his chest, because danger was no stranger to him. But the way she said it suggested something more, something buried in the soil of this very farm. And while the youngest among them stood silent, her gaze never wavered, a quiet strength shimmering in her expression, as though she carried secrets too heavy to reveal, and the weight of their presence pressed against him like the air before a storm, every second growing more tense. Yet Ethan could not pull away, for he had seen grief before, and he recognized it now in the guarded way they held themselves. Women who had endured loss and carved resilience from pain, and though they wished to drive him out, a part of him felt chained to their mystery, unwilling to walk away without knowing why their laughter rang through walls that should have remained lifeless. So he asked what danger they spoke of, but his question only deepened the silence, until the eldest finally whispered that this farm was not abandoned by chance, that men with cruel hearts had once claimed it with violence, and that those men had not disappeared, their shadows still crawling across the valley waiting for the right night to return. And the tremor in her tone told him this was no superstition but a truth sharpened by blood. And as the sun dipped outside the broken windows, the weight of evening pressed down, every creak in the wood echoing louder, every shift of wind sounding like footsteps. And Ethan understood he had stepped into more than a shelter. He had stepped into a story of survival, one that carried danger, loss, and perhaps a chance for redemption, but only if he dared to stay when every instinct warned him to ride away. Ethan's eyes wandered across the broken farmhouse, and as the uneasy silence thickened, he stepped outside into the fading glow of twilight, his boots crunching over dry soil until he reached the leaning barn, where the wood was scarred with dark circles, jagged holes torn through the planks, and he realized they were not marks of age but of bullets, each one carrying the echo of violence that had once filled the air. And when his hand brushed across the rough surface, he felt the cold shadow of a battle long gone, a battle that had left its story written into the wood, and his chest grew heavy as he followed the path beyond the barn, where the land dipped into a small clearing. There in the brittle grass stood rough wooden crosses, weather-beaten and nameless, yet each one carrying the weight of memory. And when the women joined him, their silence said more than words, until finally the eldest spoke, her voice trembling yet strong as she told him that this land had once been their home, their father's dream of a farm carved from the wilderness, a dream that grew with every season until strangers came with guns and greed, tearing it all away, leaving graves behind and forcing them to cling to the ruins. And as she spoke, the second woman's eyes hardened with cold fire, her hands tightening as she described how the outlaws had not only stolen the land, but had returned again and again, leaving scars that would never fade. And the youngest, who had been quiet before, finally whispered that the laughter Ethan had heard was not joy but defiance, the only weapon they had left against the men who had tried to break them. And Ethan felt the words strike deep because he knew the sound of loss. He had carried it across every mile of dust, but here it stood before him, embodied in 3 women who refused to bow. and for a long moment he wrestled with the pull of his old life telling him to walk away, to avoid their burden, to let the ghosts of this farm remain theirs alone. Yet his heart told him he had already stepped into their fight, that fate had dragged him here not to rest but to choose. And as the evening darkened into night, the valley seemed to close around him, every whisper of wind carrying the warning that the outlaws had not vanished. They were still out there, waiting to reclaim what they had stolen. And Ethan stood torn between fear and resolve, knowing he could ride away under the stars and never look back, or he could stay and help them reclaim the land that was written in their blood, a choice that would bind him to danger, but also perhaps to redemption. And as the women watched him with eyes that carried both hope and sorrow, he felt the weight of the past pressing against the present, demanding an answer that would decide not only their fate, but his own. Ethan's silence stretched as the weight of their sorrow pressed into his chest, and before he could speak his decision, the ground trembled faintly with the distant rhythm of hooves, a sound that made the women freeze as if the earth itself had whispered a warning. And when Ethan looked to the horizon, he saw riders cutting through the fading light, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky, and he knew without being told that these were the men who had scarred the land, returning like wolves to reclaim their prey. And in that instant Ethan's choice was made. For instead of mounting his horse to flee, he turned to the women and told them quietly but firmly that he was staying, that together they would stand against the storm that was rolling in. And though fear flickered in their eyes, there was also a fierce spark, the kind born only in those who had suffered too much to surrender again. And as the riders drew closer, the four of them moved quickly through the farm, gathering what little they had to prepare for the inevitable clash. Ethan showing them how to steady rifles, how to line sight with breath, while they showed him the secret corners of the property where shadows could be used, where fences could be broken to trap horses, where the land itself could fight on their side. And the youngest woman's hand shook as she loaded cartridges, yet her jaw tightened with resolve, while the eldest whispered a prayer under her breath, not for mercy but for strength. And Ethan felt the farm transform around him, every broken wall, every leaning post becoming part of a defense, every sound of hammer striking wood or metal echoing like a heartbeat growing faster as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in red and gold, until the riders finally reached the edge of the valley and pulled their horses to a halt, their leader raising his voice across the field with a demand that the women leave at once or face fire, his words carrying arrogance sharpened by cruelty. And for a breath it seemed the silence would swallow them all, until Ethan stepped forward with rifle in hand and shouted back that this farm was no longer theirs to claim, his voice steady though his blood thundered in his ears. And the women stood at his side, three shadows against the dying light, their faces unflinching, their weapons ready, and the tension cracked like lightning as the riders fanned out, circling with menace, the air thick with dust and threat. And Ethan tightened his grip, every sense alive with the knowledge that one wrong move would unleash chaos. But behind his fear there was a strange calm, the calm of a man who had run all his life yet now found something worth defending. And as the last glow of the sun bled into night, the standoff became unbearable, the promise of violence hanging heavy as every heartbeat in time with the coming storm. The silence broke with a single shot, and the valley erupted in fire as bullets cut through dust and screams echoed under the bleeding red sky, horses rearing and men falling while Ethan and the women fought shoulder to shoulder, every heartbeat a desperate gamble against death. And though fear clawed at them, they pressed forward with unshaken resolve, until the ground was littered with the echoes of violence and the last outlaw fled into the shadows, leaving the farm standing scarred yet unbroken. And when the smoke cleared, Ethan lowered his rifle with trembling hands, his breath ragged but his spirit fierce, and the women stood beside him, weary yet unyielding, bound by the battle they had survived together. And in their eyes he no longer saw strangers, but kin forged by blood and fire. And as the night fell quiet, they welcomed him not as a drifter but as part of their lives, though the scars of the past still whispered in the wind, reminding them that peace was fragile and tomorrow uncertain. Yet for this moment hope lived again in the ruins, a hope that would never be forgotten.